The modification started as a desperate experiment. By October 1943, the 8th Air Force was bleeding bombers faster than factories could replace them. The mathematics were brutal. Every mission over Germany cost an average of 5% of the attacking force. Some raids saw losses approaching 20%. At that rate, entire bomb groups would be wiped out before Christmas. The problem was firepower, or rather, the lack of it where it mattered most. The B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13.50 caliber machine guns distributed across 5 positions: nose, top turret, ball turret, waist and tail. Impressive on paper, inadequate in practice. German fighter pilots had identified the weak spots and exploited them ruthlessly. The most glaring vulnerability sat directly ahead. Nose attacks gave Luftwaffe pilots a nearly unobstructed path to the cockpit, navigator's compartment and bomb bay. The standard B-17 mounted 2.50 caliber guns in the nose, operated by the bombardier and navigator. Both men had primary duties that had nothing to do with shooting. When fighters came head-on, these crew members dropped their navigation tools and bomb sights to man weapons they had minimal training to use effectively. The closure rate made accuracy nearly impossible. A Focke-Wulf 190, approaching head-on at 250 miles per hour, met a B-17 flying at 180 miles per hour. Combined closure speed, 430 miles per hour. That gave both sides roughly 4 seconds from extreme range to point blank. 4 seconds to aim, fire, and hit a target while both aircraft vibrated from engine torque, prop wash, and turbulence. German pilots understood the geometry better than their American counterparts. The head-on pass minimized exposure to the bomber's defensive fire while maximizing the psychological impact on the flight crew. Watching a fighter dive straight at the cockpit, guns blazing, cannon shells walking up the fuselage, required a level of courage that exceeded what training could instill. Pilots flinched. Bombers broke formation. Once a B-17 left the protection of the combat box, it became easy prey. The 305th Bombardment Group lost 4 aircraft to head-on attacks during a single mission on October 8, 1943. The raid targeted Bremen's industrial facilities. Luftwaffe fighters stationed at nearby bases intercepted the formation over the North Sea, giving them maximum time to coordinate attacks before the bombers reached their target. The first wave came in fast and high, diving through the formation from 12 o'clock level. Cannon fire ripped through the lead aircraft's nose section, killing the bombardier instantly and wounding the navigator. The pilot fought to maintain control as hydraulic fluid sprayed across the windscreen. The bomber fell out of formation, trailing smoke from the No. 2 engine. 2 more fighters circled back and finished the job. No parachutes emerged. 3 more bombers went down the same way within 15 minutes. Head-on attacks, devastating firepower concentrated on the nose and cockpit, catastrophic damage before the defensive gunners could respond effectively. The surviving aircraft reached Bremen and dropped their bombs, but the psychological damage exceeded the physical losses. Crews returned to base, knowing they were flying death traps against an enemy that had figured out how to kill them efficiently. Major Paul Tibbets witnessed the carnage. He had flown multiple missions over Europe and understood the tactical realities better than most officers at his rank. The standard defensive armament was insufficient against coordinated head-on attacks. Something had to change, or the 8th Air Force would lose the daylight bombing campaign. The solution emerged from conversations between combat crews and maintenance personnel. What if the B-17 could mount additional forward-firing guns? Not the manually operated weapons in the nose, but a powered turret with concentrated firepower aimed precisely where the fighters were attacking from. The concept challenged existing doctrine. Army Air Force planners had designed the B-17 around the assumption that bombers would defend themselves through coordinated crossfire from multiple positions. Adding a chin turret would require significant modifications to the aircraft's structure, weight distribution, and fire control systems. The engineering challenges seemed insurmountable given the urgency of combat operations. Boeing engineers disagreed. They had been studying field reports from Europe and recognized the same vulnerability that was killing crews. The company had already begun preliminary design work on an improved B-17 variant incorporating lessons from combat. The chin turret became a priority modification. The Bendix Corporation manufactured the turret assembly, 2.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns mounted in a streamlined housing positioned below and slightly behind the bombardier station. The entire assembly could rotate through a 90-degree arc laterally and elevate through 65 degrees vertically. Total weight, 435 pounds, including ammunition. The bombardier operated the turret using a computing gun sight linked to the turret's servo motors. The system calculated lead angles automatically, compensating for aircraft speed, target speed, range, and deflection. In theory, it transformed an undertrained bombardier into an effective gunner. In practice, the system required extensive testing under combat conditions. The 305th Bombardment Group received 6 B-17Gs on November 3, 1943. The aircraft arrived with minimal documentation and no standardized training procedures for the chin turret operation. Maintenance officers studied the turret mechanisms, learning the systems through trial and error. Bombardiers practiced operating the guns on the ground, tracking imaginary targets across empty English skies. Lieutenant Robert Morgan commanded one of the modified bombers. He had survived 15 missions in the older B-17F variant and understood exactly how vulnerable the nose position was during head-on attacks. The chin turret gave him confidence that the next fighter attack might end differently. The test came on November 13th during a raid against Bremen, the same target that had cost the 305th IV aircraft a month earlier. The Luftwaffe was waiting. The formation crossed the Dutch coast at 24,000 feet, climbing into German airspace through scattered clouds that provided cover for intercepting fighters. The first attackers appeared at 10:15, climbing from below in a coordinated staffel of 12 Messerschmitt Bf-109s. They approached from 11 o'clock high, the classic head-on attack angle that had proven so effective against earlier B-17 variants. The lead fighter pilot expected the usual pattern: scattered defensive fire from undertrained bombardiers and navigators, minimal accuracy, plenty of time to line up his cannon shot before breaking away. Morgan's bombardier, Lieutenant James Fletcher, tracked the approaching fighter through his computing gun sight. The chin turret swung smoothly to follow the target. Fletcher waited until the range closed to 800 yards, then pressed both triggers. The twin .50 calibers roared. Tracers streamed towards the approaching Messerschmitt in a concentrated cone of fire. The computing gun sight worked exactly as designed, automatically calculating the lead angle and adjusting aim as the range decreased. The first rounds fell short, the second burst connected. Armor-piercing incendiaries punched through the Bf-109's engine cowling. Coolant sprayed from ruptured lines. The engine seized within seconds. The fighter rolled inverted and dropped away, trailing white glycol smoke. The pilot never completed his attack run. The remaining 11 fighters saw something they had not expected. Accurate, concentrated fire coming from a position that should have been defended by poorly aimed single guns. 3 more attackers broke off their runs early, unwilling to press through the unexpected firepower. The others adjusted their approach angles, seeking positions outside the Chin turret's field of fire. The tactical advantage lasted approximately 4 seconds. That was how long it took for the Luftwaffe pilots to recognize that the standard head-on approach was no longer safe against these particular bombers. They adapted instantly, shifting to beam attacks from 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock, positions where the waist gunners bore primary responsibility for defense. But those 4 seconds mattered. The formation reached Bremen intact. Every bomber that had left England that morning returned to base that afternoon. 0 losses. The first time the 305th had flown a Bremen mission without casualties in over a month. Word spread through the 8th Air Force within hours. The modified B-17S had teeth where it mattered. Bombardiers, who had previously felt helpless during fighter attacks, now had the tools to fight back effectively. The psychological impact exceeded the tactical advantage. Luftwaffe intelligence officers noticed the change by mid-November. Interrogation reports from downed American aircrews mentioned new defensive turrets on some B-17S. German fighter pilots reported increased losses during head-on attacks against specific bomber formations. The pattern suggested a significant modification to American defensive capabilities. The response came from Major Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced bomber destroyers. He commanded Jagdgeschwader II and had personally developed many of the tactics German fighters used against American bomber formations. His solution to the Chin turret was elegant and brutal: attack from below. The ventral ball turret covered the B-17's lower hemisphere, but it had limitations. The gunner sat cramped in a rotating sphere, barely large enough for his body and 2 guns. The position offered excellent visibility, but terrible working conditions. At high altitude, temperatures inside the turret dropped to -60 degrees. The confined space made extended operations exhausting. Some gunners lasted 15 minutes before fatigue degraded their effectiveness. Meyer instructed his pilots to approach from 6 o'clock low, using the bomber's own fuselage to mask their approach until the last possible moment. Then pull up sharply, firing upward into the bomber's belly, where fuel tanks and bomb bays offered vulnerable targets. The ball turret gunner would have minimal time to react. The Chin turret could not depress far enough to engage targets directly below. The tactic worked. On November 26th, a formation of B-17Gs encountered fighters using Meyer's new approach over northern Germany. 3 bombers went down in the first 10 minutes of combat. The Chin turrets proved useless against an enemy attacking from below. The tactical chess match continued through December. American gunners learned to coordinate fire between the ball turret and waist positions, creating overlapping fields of fire that made low attacks more dangerous. German pilots responded by increasing their attack speeds, reducing exposure time at the cost of accuracy. Each side studied the other's methods and adapted. Boeing engineers monitored combat reports closely. The Chin turret was working as designed, but it had not solved the broader problem of bomber vulnerability to fighter attack. The B-17G represented an improvement over earlier variants, but German pilots were already developing counter-tactics that negated the advantages. The real solution arrived in early 1944, though it had nothing to do with bomber modifications. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with external fuel tanks, could escort bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany. Fighter cover eliminated the need for purely defensive armament. Bombers still needed guns, but they no longer had to survive alone against overwhelming fighter opposition. The Chin turret remained standard equipment on all B-17Gs produced after September 1943. Over 8,600 aircraft rolled out of Boeing, Douglas and Vega plants with the modification installed. The turret became one of the Flying Fortress's most recognizable features, visible in countless photographs and combat films. Statistics measuring the Chin turret's effectiveness remained inconclusive. Some bomber groups reported reduced losses after receiving B-17Gs. Others saw no measurable change. The data suggested the turret helped, but quantifying exactly how much proved difficult. Too many variables influenced combat outcomes: fighter escort availability, target selection, weather conditions, crew experience, and pure chance. Individual experiences told a different story. Bombardiers who had survived head-on attacks in older B-17S, then flew missions in the modified aircraft, reported significantly higher confidence levels. The psychological impact of having real defensive capability rather than makeshift guns operated while trying to manage bombing duties cannot be overstated. Lieutenant Fletcher, Morgan's bombardier, survived 35 missions over Europe. He credited the Chin turret with saving his life at least 3 times, possibly more. Years later, he would describe the modification as the difference between being a victim and being a participant in his own defense. The Luftwaffe never solved the Chin turret problem completely. German fighter pilots learned to work around it, attacking from angles that minimized exposure to the concentrated forward fire, but they never regained the easy kills that head-on attacks had provided in early 1943. Every tactical advantage extracted a cost, and the B-17G made that cost substantially higher. Production numbers reflected the modification's perceived value. By war's end, the B-17G represented over 75% of all Flying Fortresses ever built. The earlier models without Chin turrets were relegated to training duties or modified for specialized reconnaissance roles. Combat operations demanded the improved defensive capability. The modification influenced bomber design philosophy for decades. When Boeing developed the B-29 Super Fortress, engineers incorporated forward-firing turrets from the initial design phase. Later aircraft like the B-36 and B-52 featured multiple powered turrets, providing overlapping fields of fire. The lesson from the B-17G was clear. Defensive armament had to cover all approach angles with concentrated, accurate fire. Individual stories from the modification's combat history remain scattered across archives and veteran accounts. A bombardier who shot down 2 fighters during a single mission over Berlin. A crew that survived when the Chin turret jammed on takeoff, forcing them to abort rather than face fighters with degraded forward defense. A maintenance sergeant who worked through the night repairing battle-damaged turret motors so his crew could fly the next morning. These moments accumulated into a broader narrative about innovation under pressure. The Chin turret represented the American approach to air combat: identify the problem, engineer a solution, implement it rapidly, then refine based on combat feedback. The cycle repeated continuously throughout the war, driving improvements that kept pace with enemy tactics. The Luftwaffe followed a similar process, but faced resource constraints that limited implementation. German engineers developed excellent aircraft designs, but production capacity could not match American output. By late 1944, quality declined as factories prioritized quantity over precision manufacturing. The technical edge that German fighters had enjoyed earlier in the war eroded under the weight of industrial capacity differences. The B-17G flew its last combat mission over Europe on April 25, 1945. The war ended 2 weeks later. In less than 2 years of combat operations, the modified bombers had helped establish air superiority over Germany, destroying the industrial base that sustained the Nazi war machine. Post-war analysis credited multiple factors for the 8th Air Force's success: long-range fighter escorts, improved tactics, overwhelming numerical superiority, and incremental aircraft improvements like the Chin turret. No single modification won the air war, but each contributed to the cumulative advantage that eventually overwhelmed German defenses. The modified B-17S that survived the war met different fates. Some returned to the United States for display in victory parades and war bond drives. Others were scrapped immediately, their aluminum recycled for peacetime production. A few found their way into museums, preserved as examples of the aircraft that had carried the daylight bombing campaign over Europe. One B-17G sits in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. The Chin turret remains in place, the twin gun barrels pointed forward as if still searching for targets. Visitors can examine the turret mechanism, see the computing gun sight, understand how bombardiers operated the system while managing their primary duties. The aircraft represents more than engineering innovation. It stands as evidence that adaptation under pressure can shift tactical balance in combat. The Luftwaffe had dominated the skies over Germany in early 1943. By mid-1944, they were fighting a defensive war against an enemy that had solved the problems that had been killing bomber crews. The modification that started as a desperate experiment became standard equipment on thousands of aircraft. The Chin turret gave crews a fighting chance when fighters attacked from ahead. It was not a miracle weapon. It did not make bombers invulnerable, but it reduced casualties, improved morale, and forced the enemy to develop new tactics that were less effective than the old ones. That was enough. In war, small advantages compound over time. The B-17G's Chin turret represented one small advantage among many. Combined with fighter escorts, improved tactics, better training, and overwhelming numbers, it helped win the air war over Europe. The men who flew these aircraft rarely discussed technical specifications after the war. They remembered friends lost, missions survived, and the constant fear that accompanied every trip over enemy territory. The Chin turret was just another piece of equipment, as ordinary to them as the oxygen mask and heated flight suit. But for historians studying the air campaign, the modification represents a critical moment when American industrial capacity and engineering innovation combined to solve a tactical problem that was killing aircrews. The solution was not perfect, but it worked well enough to change outcomes. The Luftwaffe learned about the modification the hard way, watching fighters fall to concentrated fire from a position they had previously exploited with impunity. They adapted their tactics, as professional military forces always do, but they could not regain the advantage they had held before the modification appeared. The technical specifications of the Bendix Chin turret revealed the engineering challenges Boeing had overcome. The turret assembly weighed 435 pounds fully loaded, but that figure told only part of the story. The installation required reinforcing the aircraft's nose structure to handle firing loads that generated over 2,000 pounds of recoil force. The fuselage frame beneath the bombardier's station received additional support beams. The aircraft's center of gravity shifted slightly forward, requiring ballast adjustments in the tail section to maintain proper flight characteristics. The ammunition feed system presented its own challenges. Each gun required a clear path for the belt feed from storage boxes positioned behind the turret. The belts snaked through confined spaces already crowded with oxygen lines, electrical conduits, and control cables. Maintenance crews learned to thread new ammunition belts through the system with the same care a watchmaker would use assembling a complex mechanism. One misaligned round could jam the entire feed system, rendering both guns useless at the moment they were needed most. The computing gun sight represented a technological marvel for its time. The Mark 15 sight used a gyroscopic mechanism to calculate lead angles automatically, accounting for target speed, aircraft speed, range and deflection. The bombardier placed a lighted reticle on the target and kept it there while the sight's internal mechanisms did the complex mathematics. The system worked brilliantly when everything functioned correctly. When electrical systems failed or gyroscopes tumbled from battle damage, the sight reverted to a simple iron ring, forcing bombardiers to estimate lead angles manually. Training bombardiers to operate the Chin turret while managing their primary bombing duties required developing new procedures. The Bombardier School at Big Spring, Texas added 2 weeks to the standard curriculum specifically for Chin turret operation. Students spent hours in mock-up fuselages, tracking targets projected on screens while simultaneously running through bomb site calculations. The dual responsibility proved manageable during training. Combat added stress factors that no classroom could replicate. The first combat use of the Chin turret occurred on November 3, 1943, during a raid against Wilhelmshaven. The mission targeted U-boat construction facilities on Germany's northern coast. Weather conditions were marginal, with cloud cover extending from 8,000 feet to 18,000 feet. The bomber formation climbed through the overcast, emerging into clear air at 22,000 feet. Luftwaffe fighters intercepted over the Frisian Islands, climbing from bases at Jever and Wittmundhafen. The attacking force consisted primarily of Focke-Wulf 19s from Jägerschwader 1, an experienced unit that had been destroying Allied bombers since 1942. They approached in the standard manner, head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high, diving through the formation at maximum speed. The lead element consisted of 4 fighters flying in a loose finger 4 formation. They dove from 25,000 feet, building speed to over 400 miles per hour before leveling off 2,000 yards ahead of the bomber stream. The closure rate exceeded 550 miles per hour. Standard engagement doctrine gave them approximately 8 seconds from extreme range to point blank. 3 B-17Gs with chin turrets flew in the lead squadron. The bombardiers tracked the approaching fighters through their computing gun sights. At 1,200 yards, all 3 turrets opened fire simultaneously. 18.50 caliber gun barrels sent a concentrated stream of tracers toward the attacking fighters. The volume of fire exceeded anything the German pilots had experienced during previous head-on attacks. The lead fighter absorbed multiple hits. Armor-piercing incendiaries punched through the engine cowling, severed fuel lines, and ignited aviation gasoline in the fuel injection system. The Focke-Wulf's BMW 801 radial engine exploded in a ball of orange flame. The aircraft disintegrated at 24,000 feet. No parachute emerged. The remaining 3 fighters broke formation immediately. 2 rolled inverted and dove away. The 3rd pulled up sharply, climbing back into the sun before the defensive gunners could track him. The attack that should have resulted in damaged bombers and possible kills instead produced 1 confirmed German loss and 0 American casualties. Similar encounters occurred throughout the mission. German fighters attempted 17 separate head-on attacks against the lead squadron. The chin turrets engaged every time, forcing attackers to break off early or accept catastrophic fire while pressing their runs. By the time the formation reached Wilhelmshaven, the Luftwaffe had shifted tactics entirely, focusing on beam attacks and rear hemisphere approaches where the new turrets could not engage. The mission results supported the modification's value. The 3 squadrons equipped with B-17Gs reported 0 losses despite flying in the most exposed positions. Squadrons flying older B-17Fs in trail formations lost 2 aircraft to fighter attacks. The correlation suggested that forward firepower made a measurable difference in combat outcomes. German intelligence analyzed the Wilhelmshaven mission through multiple sources. Luftwaffe fighter pilots provided detailed debriefings describing the unexpected defensive fire. Radio intercepts captured American crew communications mentioning the new turret systems. Reconnaissance photographs of crashed B-17S in occupied Europe showed the chin turret installation on some aircraft. By early December, German intelligence had compiled a reasonably accurate assessment of the modification and its capabilities. The response came from multiple directions. Fighter tactics evolved to minimize exposure to forward fire. Aircraft design bureaus investigated similar turret installations for German bombers, though production priorities prevented implementation. Anti-aircraft artillery units received updated aircraft recognition materials showing the modified B-17 silhouette. The entire German air defense system adapted to counter the new threat. Major Heinz Knoke, commander of I/JG-11, developed specific tactics for engaging B-17Gs. His unit operated from bases near Hanover, positioning them along the primary bomber routes into central Germany. Knoke had studied the chin turret's capabilities and identified its limitations. The turret could not engage targets directly below or to the extreme sides. Attacks from those angles remained viable. His solution involved splitting his fighter force into 2 groups. The first group would approach head-on, drawing the chin turret's fire and forcing the bombardiers to engage. While the American gunners focused forward, the second group would attack from 9 o'clock level, hitting the bombers from the side where waist gunners bore defensive responsibility. The coordinated attack split the bombers' defensive fire between multiple threats, reducing the effectiveness of any single defensive position. The tactic worked during a mission against Brunswick on January 11, 1944. Noakes fighters executed the split attack perfectly. The lead group approached from 12 o'clock, forcing the Chin turrets to engage. While the bombardiers fired forward, the second group slashed through from the side, cannon shells ripping through thin aluminum skin where armor protection was minimal. The 305th Bombardment Group lost 3 aircraft in 4 minutes. The tactical evolution continued through winter. American formations began flying tighter combat boxes, creating overlapping fields of fire that made coordinated attacks more dangerous. German fighters responded by concentrating their forces, accepting higher losses in exchange for overwhelming local sections of the bomber stream. Each side pushed the other toward extremes, seeking advantages that could shift the balance. The arrival of long-range fighter escorts in February 1944 changed everything. P-51 Mustangs could accompany bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany, engaging Luftwaffe fighters before they could organize attacks against the bomber formations. The Chin turret remained valuable, but it no longer represented the primary defense against fighter attack. That role shifted to the escorting fighters. Combat statistics from February through May 1944 showed declining bomber losses despite increasing mission frequency and deeper penetrations into German territory. Multiple factors contributed: fighter escorts, improved tactics, declining Luftwaffe pilot quality as experienced airmen were killed faster than training programs could replace them, and cumulative aircraft improvements, including the Chin turret. Maintenance records revealed the turret's reliability under combat conditions. The Bendix design proved robust, functioning in temperatures ranging from minus 60 degrees at altitude to over 100 degrees on the ground during summer missions. The servo motors occasionally froze at extreme altitude, requiring manual operation until the systems warmed enough to restore power. The ammunition feed system jammed more frequently than Boeing's engineers had hoped, usually from belt links damaged during rough handling or installation. Ground crews learned the turret's quirks through experience. Certain serial number ranges had manufacturing defects in the azimuth bearing, causing binding at specific rotation angles. Some turrets exhibited electrical faults that only manifested at high altitude when moisture condensation affected circuit connections. The maintenance teams developed workarounds for known issues, keeping the turrets operational through improvisation and determination. The combat footage from B-17G missions showed the Chin turret in action against German fighters. Gun camera films captured the moment when concentrated forward fire disrupted attack runs that should have resulted in bomber casualties. The images reinforced what crews had been reporting. The modification worked. Fighters that previously pressed attacks to point-blank range now broke off early, accepting degraded accuracy to avoid the concentrated defensive fire. Psychological effects extended beyond individual crews. Entire bomb groups reported improved morale after receiving B-17Gs. The knowledge that they possessed better defensive capability than earlier formations had carried made the constant danger seem slightly more manageable. Combat operations remained terrifying, but the terror became endurable when crews believed they had the tools to fight back effectively. German prisoner interrogations provided insight into Luftwaffe pilot perspectives. Captured aircrews described increased respect for American bomber defensive fire after encountering B-17Gs. The easy kills that had characterized 1943 operations disappeared. Every attack carried risk. The psychological impact of watching comrades die during what should have been routine interceptions eroded German fighter pilot morale steadily through 1944. The modification influenced bomber doctrine beyond the immediate tactical impact. The success of adding concentrated forward firepower validated the principle that defensive armament should cover all approach angles with effective fire. Future bomber designs incorporated this lesson. The B-29 featured 4 remote-controlled turrets covering the entire defensive hemisphere. The concept traced directly to combat experience with the B-17G's chin turret. Production improvements streamlined chin turret installation as factories gained experience with the modification. Early B-17Gs required approximately 40 hours of additional labor per aircraft to install and test the turret system. By mid-1944, production line refinements reduced installation time to 18 hours. The efficiency gains allowed factories to increase output without proportional increases in labor hours. Quality control remained critical. A malfunctioning chin turret represented more than a maintenance headache. It meant sending crews into combat with degraded defensive capability against an enemy that would exploit any weakness. Boeing instituted rigorous testing procedures for every turret assembly before installation. The commitment to quality prevented numerous potential failures that could have cost lives. Combat veteran accounts consistently emphasized the psychological importance of the chin turret. Bombardiers described feeling less helpless during fighter attacks. The ability to return concentrated fire rather than scattered shots from manually aimed guns transformed their experience of combat. They remained vulnerable, but they were no longer passive targets waiting for German fighters to decide their fate. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The B-17G had flown its last combat mission 2 weeks earlier. In 18 months of operations, the modified bombers had participated in hundreds of raids, dropped thousands of tons of bombs, and helped establish the air superiority that made the invasion of Europe possible. The chin turret represented one small piece of that larger achievement. Post-war assessments credited the B-17G with reduced loss rates compared to earlier variants, though isolating the chin turret's specific contribution remained difficult. Too many variables affected combat outcomes. What remained clear was that bomber crews preferred flying the modified aircraft. When given the choice, they chose the B-17G every time. That preference alone suggested the modification had delivered meaningful value. The legacy extended beyond statistics and combat reports. The chin turret demonstrated that innovation under pressure could shift tactical balance even against a competent, adaptive enemy. The Luftwaffe had dominated European skies in early 1943. By late 1944, they were fighting a losing battle against an opponent that had solved the problems that had been killing bomber crews. The modification that started as a desperate experiment became a symbol of American industrial and engineering capability. Identify the problem, design a solution, implement it rapidly, refine based on feedback. The cycle represented everything that made the American war effort successful: adaptability, innovation, and the industrial capacity to transform good ideas into combat-ready hardware faster than enemies could develop countermeasures. The men who flew these aircraft are mostly gone now. Time claims everyone eventually, but their legacy remains in museums, archives, and the historical record. They flew into the most heavily defended airspace in history, sustained losses that would be considered unacceptable by any modern standard, and kept flying until the job was done. The chin turret helped some of them survive. For those crews, the modification represented the difference between coming home and becoming another name on a memorial wall. The B-17G stands as evidence that small improvements matter in combat. The chin turret did not win the war by itself, but it saved lives, improved outcomes, and forced the enemy to adapt in ways that reduced their effectiveness. Sometimes that is enough. In war, victory emerges from the accumulation of small advantages compounded over time. The chin turret was one such advantage. Combined with thousands of others, it helped win the air war over Europe.